Welcome in, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Facing Reality. I'm your host, Ron Arnold. It is Monday, October the 1st, 2007, and I appreciate you tuning in with us tonight. We have a very informative program for you tonight. Our guest is going to be Mr. John Perkins. He's written several books. The two that I have in front of me are Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and his latest book is The Secret History of the American Empire, Economic Hitmen, Jackals, and the Truth About Global Corruption. Well, Mr. Perkins, are you with us?
I am right here, Ron. Good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Ron. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. I had spoken to Miss Booth, and she actually sent me out some press information here, and I did not have time, to read both these books or much of either one of them, but I have gone over the information that she did send me, and I tell you what, it just fits perfectly in with an interview that we had done last week on my program with Mr. G. Edward Griffin, who authored The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Well, yes.
And what I hope you can do for us tonight is put into perspective how you, as a part of this system, this global system that's been built, how you, I guess, affected change in some of these countries that favored this corporation. But Mr. Perkins, here, I'm going to read this little bit right here now, and then we'll get into it here. As an economic hitman, John's job was to convince third world countries to accept enormous loans for infrastructure development, loans that were much larger than needed, and to guarantee that the development projects were contracted to U.S. corporations like Halliburton and Bechtel. Once these countries were saddled with huge debts, the U.S. government and the international aid agencies that were allied with it, were able to control these economies and to ensure that oil and other resources were channeled to serve the interests of building a global empire. Now, we talk a lot on my program about this stuff, and I'm trying to get the people to understand that things are not as they perceive in most cases. I believe, in my opinion, we have a government that is no longer working in the people's best interest. It is simply trying to bolster the strength of the corporations and, as you state clearly in here, build an empire. And that is what I see, and the information I've read so far on this, backs that up. But can you tell us, in your words, what an economic hitman is?
Well, yeah, Ron, I'd be glad to. I totally agree with you. And the government is there basically to serve the corporations, and I'm certainly not just talking about the Bush government by any means, or Republican government. This happens under Democratic as well as Republican presidents, and the Congress is controlled by Democrats as well as Republicans. In fact, we're really pretty much run by the corporations, but we can get into that a little bit more. In answer to your question, I think it's fair to say that since World War II, increasingly, economic hitmen like me have managed to build the world's first truly global empire. And we've managed to do it primarily without the military. For the first time in history, an empire has been built primarily without the military, but instead through economics. And we work in many different ways, but I think the most common one, as it was sort of summed up in what you read earlier, is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country through the World Bank or one of its sisters. However, the country doesn't get the money. Instead, the money goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power systems, power plants, industrial parks, roads, ports, airports, things that benefit a few rich people in the country, as well as our own corporations, but don't really help the majority of the people, the poor people, who are the majority in most of these countries, because they're not connected to the electrical grid, or if they are, they just have one or two light bulbs. They don't have the skills to get themselves jobs in industrial parks. They don't use ports or airports or highways. But they and the whole country are left holding this huge debt. and it's so big that they can't possibly repay it. So at some point, we economic hitmen go back and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debt, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies.
Mm-hmm.
Or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote. Or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. We were sort of implied that all these different countries that sent troops to Iraq did so because they believed in the cause there. The fact is that many of them sent troops there because they were essentially blackmailed into doing it. They owed us so much money.
You guys were calling in favors.
Right.
Or maybe not you at that point, but I don't know if you were still involved in it then or not.
No, I got out in '81 actually, and I've been kind of hanging around the peripheries. I've kept in touch with a lot of it, but I haven't officially been doing it. And Ron, incidentally, when we fail, which doesn't happen too often, and I talk in the book about how I did fail with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and also in Panama with Omar Torrijos. When we do fail, then the next line of defense is what we call the jackals. And these are men who are sent in to overthrow the governments or assassinate their leaders. And in the case of my failures in Ecuador with Roldos and in Panama with Torrijos, both of those men were assassinated because I failed to corrupt them. I failed to bring them around. They were very integrated human beings and would not be bought, so they paid the ultimate price. When the jackals fail, when both of us fail, which is very, very seldom, but that's what happened in Iraq, then and only then do we send in the military.
So you guys, the economic hitmen, go in first and try to basically bribe these countries into taking out loans, and you guys trying to get them in a subservient situation. When your first level of attack fails, then they send in the jackals that try to fail the economy or assassinate the leaders. And when that doesn't work, then we do the regime change, right?
The military goes in, correct.
That's right. That's right. And actually, I believe that you had if I read this correctly, you kind of became close with Mr. Torrijos and the president from Ecuador, and you kind of admired the men. Is that right?
I did. I speak Spanish fluently, and I still spend a lot of time in Latin America. I just came back from there, in fact. And I was especially close to Omar Torrijos and liked him very much. A very charismatic man, and had a great deal of integrity. He was a human being. He had his flaws too, like we all do. But he told me, I don't need your money. He said, I've got a good house, I got good cars and food, and I don't need any more money. What I want to do is help my people.
Wow.
And so I'm not going to go along with your system because I know what you're trying to do is make us subservient. We've been subservient to you all of this century. And now you owe us big time, and I'm not going to get caught in that trap again. I'm not going to do that. And ironically, when Jaime Roldos, the president of Ecuador, was assassinated in May of '81, Torrijos said to his family and that he was pretty sure he would be next. But,
really?
But he said, I'm ready to go because I think I've done my job. And what he meant by that was the big job he'd done was he'd gotten Carter to sign the Panama Canal Treaty, turning the canal over to Panama, which he thought was essential. So he said, I'm ready to go. I think I'm next, and I'm ready to go. I've done my job. And 3 months later, in June of '81, he too was assassinated.
And that was in a plane crash?
Yeah, both of them went down in their own private Twin Otter planes, and there was no question for the people that were aware of what was going on that this was the CIA orchestrated assassination. Planes are really the favored way to do it because it's pretty easy to rig a plane so it will go down. Its instrumentation is wrong. You think you're flying a lot higher than you are. The pilot hits a mountain, whatever, and all the evidence disappears.
Well, what about Ron Brown? Is that the case with him?
I can't speak from personal experience. I was quite familiar with Ron Brown. We both went to the same college. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, but I can't. I don't like to speculate. I wasn't personally involved in that one. I was with Torrijos and Roldos. I have no doubts about those. With Ron Brown, I'm also always asked about Paul Wellstone. I don't have any personal experience with either one of them, so I hesitate to say anything.
Okay. An economic forecaster. What is an economic forecaster?
Well, you know what? How did we justify these huge loans to the World Bank? And you in the World Bank, you had a whole staff of people that were always trying to pick holes in what I was doing. Now, at the very top, they wanted me to win. They wanted to go along. They were part of the whole deal. But they hired excellent economists to try to pick holes, and their job officially was to pick holes in what we did. What we would do would be develop a 20 to 25-year forecast of the economies of these countries that we targeted. And we would show that if we made these huge loans to these countries and built the power plants and the highways and the ports and all these other things that our own corporations would build, if that happened, then over the next 20 to 25 years, the economic base of the country would grow tremendously. So the GDP, the overall economic measures would skyrocket.
And you guys could rig these forecasts to make it a good selling point, correct?
Yeah, we knew we were doing this. We inflated them tremendously so that it would show to everybody that these loans ought to be made. The fact of the matter is that usually these infrastructure projects do help the economy. They make the economy grow somewhat, not as much as we would predict them to do.
Right.
But the sad part of that is that many of these countries, when you get economic growth, it really only impacts a few very wealthy people because the majority of the people aren't really part of the economic base anyway. They're living off subsistence farms, and they're serving basically as indentured servants to people. And so, in fact, what happens when you get this economic growth, when it's done that way with these huge infrastructure projects, is you just widen the gap between the rich and the poor even more.
Yeah.
And we've seen that that's what has happened over the last 3 or 4 decades, that the gap has just widened tremendously.
I see, and in my opinion, they're destroying the middle class of America intentionally. But you mentioned something whenever you were, when you first started speaking, talking about that these loans don't normally go straight to those countries. They go through American corporations. But we're going to head to a break. But when we come back, I'd like you to elaborate on that just a little bit, because that is the biggie to me, is how these contracts and loans were sold to these countries, but it was still channeled and in the contracts that they had to use the American corporations to come do this work. So if you'll hold the line, sir, we'll be right back in just a couple of minutes.
Wonderful.
All right, we're back on Facing Reality, everyone. I thank you for staying with us. Mr. Perkins, you still with us?
I sure am.
I tell you what, they changed my bumper music here, and it's so good I hate to turn it down.
No.
I would like to that sounds good, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Well, I need to make a couple of announcements real quick, but first I'd like to congratulate you on being a grandpa for the first time.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's also a pretty awesome responsibility. It makes us know we've got to make this a better world. We've got to turn things around, you know?
Yes, sir, and you also cover in some of these, in part of this book also, about that it is not too late, and there are a lot of things that we can do to turn this around. We want to also mention something about the law of the sea treaty that's coming up for a vote here pretty soon. But we're talking to Mr. John Perkins, author, and he's been a teacher. How about telling us some of the things that you've done besides being an economic hitman, Mr. Perkins?
Well, yeah, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer when I first got out of business school and working in the Amazon, and actually that was part of my training to become a economic hitman. That's another story, but it's detailed in the book. And then after I left being an economic hitman, I ran an alternative energy business. I owned and ran it for about 10 years. We built environmentally good power plants and energy projects. It's something I'm very, very proud of. Since that time, beginning in about 1990, I've been devoting myself to nonprofit organizations which help indigenous people in the Amazon, the Himalayas, all over the world, especially in the countries that we economic hitmen ripped off in the past. So trying to help these people, especially helping them fight the oil companies in places like the Amazon, and writing books and teaching and going around and lecturing. I do a lot of lecturing, and I'd love to have some of your audiences come and hear me sometime. They can check me out at johnperkins.org. The schedule's there.
Okay, I neglected to give that out. I apologize. I want to say something else, too. I'm joined in the studio by a gentleman, Mr. Bill Witwicky. He sits in here with me every Monday night. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Army. And Mr. Witwicky is just now being, I guess, turned on to this information about this, I call it a conspiracy. And I read, your description of it. If it was that simple, it might be a little bit correctable, a little bit more easily corrected, but it's a little deeper than just a conspiracy. But Mr. Witwicky is coming around and seeing the light, and spreading the word on this stuff. He thought that this stuff was horse feathers, but he sees it now. He's read a few books. Have you read John Coleman's book, Committee of 300?
You talking to me now? No, I have not. But I'd like to say, I think one of the tragedies of all this, Ron, is that so many people are like Mr. Witwicky in that we don't know what's going on. It's why I wrote the book after 9/11. Is when I decided I had to write Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because it was terribly important that the American people understand why there's a lot of resentment in the world. And this, of course, is not in any way to condone mass murder or what happened at 9/11, but it is to say that I felt that we American people really need to understand this basic part of our foreign policy. A democracy is based on the premise that we have an informed electorate. And if the electorate doesn't know where a great deal of our foreign aid is going and what a huge part of our foreign policy is all about, then it's hard to really say that we are an informed electorate. And if we're not an informed electorate, it's hard to claim to truly be a democracy. I'm a very strong patriot. My family goes back about 400 years in this country. I had ancestors who fought in the Revolution and every other major war that this country fought, and I'm terribly disturbed by what I'm seeing today, by the way that America is viewed, and by the things that we have been doing, by the things that I did around the world to create this empire, which is contrary to all of the principles that I was raised to believe are what make America great, what people like Mr. Witwicky went in the Army for, to defend.
Right.
And in many places around the world now, we're no longer defending those principles. In fact, we're subverting them.
Well, in your books here, you have described quite a bit of these things, and I'd like to tell the folks, you just mentioned the website. It is www.johnperkins.org, and you can purchase these books from that website. And I suggest people, if you want to know how this operation works and is still being conducted today, these books will explain that to you. The one that came out first was Mr. John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Then you followed it up with The Secret History of the American Empire. But you began to write this book 4 different times and stopped it each time. Why did you stop each time that you began up until the catalyst of September the 11th that really kicked you into gear and you finished it? Why did you stop it?
Well, each time I started to write it, I went out and contacted other people who had been in the business with me, other economic hitmen and jackals, and I wanted to include their stories. And each time I was then threatened. My life was threatened. I had a young child. She's now 25. Just the one who just gave me a grandson. Right. And I was offered bribes, and I succumbed.
You deferred.
I deferred. The threats frightened me, and I took the bribes. And incidentally, a lot of the money that I got from that I put toward these nonprofit organizations, so it kind of assuaged my guilt. I mean, I knew I would been on the other end. I knew these people were serious. I knew what they could do to me, and so I deferred. And I wrote other books. I wrote books about indigenous people and donated a lot of money to that. So I kind of, sort of assuaged my guilt, justified myself. But then on 9/11, I happened to be in the Amazon on that day. But right after I got back, I went up to Ground Zero. And as I stood there looking down into that smoldering pit, I knew I had to finally write this book, these books, because I knew that the American people just didn't understand why there's so much anger and resentment, and that we must understand that. If we're a democracy, we have to understand it. So this time I decided that I would write it, but I wouldn't tell anybody I was writing it. I would do it totally on my own. Even my wife and daughter didn't know what I was writing about until the manuscript was in the hands of my very competent New York publisher and agent, and he'd sent it out to a lot of major publishing houses. At that point, it became my best insurance policy,
right?
Because any good jackal knows that if at that point, if something strange happens to me, the book's going to sell millions of copies. And as it turns out, it has. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list a long time, over a year and a half.
Yeah.
But it would sell even more copies if I were to suddenly disappear or die a violent death.
Right. Okay. Well, we're up against the bottom of the hour break, but we didn't get to talk about the Halliburton and Bechtel and the American corporations having these contracts funneled through them. So when we get back, we'll get straight to that, and I'd like you to explain that so the people will understand how this racket is working. But if you'll hold on, we're going to head to a break.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. All right, we're back on Facing Reality, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. Our guest tonight is Mr. John Perkins, author and self-professed former economic hitman. And we've been talking about it. He has a couple of books, several books out, but the two that I have in front of me, the ones that you need to get your paws on and put into your library. The first one he wrote in, I guess it's sort of a series, would be Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It describes the way that the government and the corporation, which I call one, sent their men into these foreign countries and bribed them into taking out massive loans from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in order to get these people subservient to the government corporation. And they're what you call the corporatocracy?
Yes, that's correct, Ron. I think, an empire needs an emperor. And I give the definition in the Secret History of the American Empire of empire, and there's basically 8 parts, and you only need to satisfy a couple of those to be one, and we satisfy all of them. But one of them is to have an emperor. Now, an emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and reports to no one. Obviously, our president doesn't fall in that category, nor do our elected officials. But the people that really pull the strings are the people who run our biggest corporations. And they're not elected, they don't serve a limited term, and they don't report to anyone. They like to say they report to their boards, but their boards, they all serve on each other's boards, and basically they control their own boards. And they also control our politics pretty much. Every major politician in this country is beholden to big money that comes out of corporations, the stockholders, particularly the managers of those corporations. They're very, very swayed by corporations and by their lobbyists and their campaign funds. The big corporations, the corporatocracy, also owns our media, for the most part, our mainstream media, either through direct ownership or through advertising. And so they really are calling the shots. And, of course, at the top of our government, they tend to be one and the same person. So you got a guy who's CEO of a major corporation for a few years, and then he becomes, or she becomes Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or Vice President or even President, and then they go back out into the corporate world. So at the very, very top, there's this constant revolving door where it's really hard to tell whether a person's actually working for Halliburton or serving as Vice President. And, and I don't mean to pick on Dick Cheney, he's been picked on plenty, but this has been the case, like Kennedy's Defense Secretary McNamara, who became president of the World Bank, had previously been president of Ford Motor Company, and on and on. It happens on Democrats and Republicans alike.
Yeah, we did a show, or I did a show and talked about Monsanto and the EPA having that revolving door, how a lady with the EPA, with Monsanto, wrote a report to be submitted to the EPA, set it on her desk, quit her job, got hired into the Environmental Protection Agency office, reviewed her own report and approved it, then went back to work for Monsanto. Isn't that something?
Yeah, that's pretty. But it sounds amazing. It sounds almost cartoonish.
It does.
But unfortunately, it's repeated over and over and over again.
All right, and the website is johnperkins.org, so you can purchase these books, folks. Like I said, you need to add them to your library and read them, and hand them to your relatives and your friends, and get this word out, because we're going to make a difference. There's no option. We don't have a choice. If we don't, it's going to get a lot worse. All right, you arranged these loans, but they did not go straight to these countries. What happened?
Well, in fact, they don't ever leave the United States. The money goes from a bank in Washington, D.C., let's say, to Bechtel's Bank in San Francisco, or Halliburton's in Houston, or another big construction company in Chicago or Boston. So even though the loan is given to Ecuador or Nigeria or some other country, it never goes there. And they don't even have the right to choose on what contractors are going to be on the job for the most part. And then these U.S. companies go to that country and they build these huge infrastructure projects that they make a huge amount of money off building them. Those infrastructure projects, as I said earlier, may benefit a few rich people in those countries, the ones who own the big industries and who own the apartment buildings and the mansions and use a lot of the electricity, et cetera. But they don't help the poor people, and that was the majority of the people at all. And yet the country has to pay back that loan with very high interest rates. And so, what a deal,
Really?
Yeah, make a loan to someone under the condition that they have to hire you to give them, to sell them, build them something that they don't need.
Unbelievable. That's a pretty good racket.
It's an incredible racket, and yet it's destroying our country, the United States, as well as these other countries, because it's making people around the world extremely angry. We've created a very, very dangerous world, and we all have to recognize that this is a small world now. We're terribly interdependent. In the 70s, when I was an economic hitman, I remember taking 3 days to make a phone call from Jakarta, Indonesia, to Boston. Now you can, with some of these satellite cell phones, you can call from the deep, most remote spots in the Amazon instantaneously. And, we're I suspect in your studio right now, on your body, you're wearing clothes, and in your studio there's equipment that's come from every continent on this planet. And we're a very interdependent world. We must recognize that in order for my grandson to expect to inherit a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world, every child being born in Ethiopia and in Indonesia and in Bolivia and in Palestine and Israel has to have that same expectation of growing up in a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world. We must recognize that we cannot have homeland security here in the United States until we see that the whole world is, in fact, our homeland.
Now, I agree with that, because what I believe is that a lot of these people in these foreign countries, they see what the United States corporation is doing, and as I've heard it put before, they won't be able to defeat our military, but if they, turn their ire toward the American people, they may try to force us to create a change in our own country at the top, which needs to happen. We need to do that, but unfortunately, a lot of people just are not paying attention to this stuff, and they're living in what I call a fantasy world.
Now, our big corporations made tremendous amounts of money in Vietnam, and they're making tremendous amounts of money in Iraq. Our soldiers are suffering terribly in both of those wars, and we're all suffering the consequences of that with a destroyed economy, essentially, here, tremendous death, and men and women coming back from these wars that are wounded permanently, physically, emotionally, in ways we don't even understand fully, and creating a very, very dangerous world. But the corporations, the corporatocracy, has made fortunes off these wars. So to them, they look like victories, but they're certainly not military victories.
True. I understand that. We were talking about dreamchange.org. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yes, it's a nonprofit organization that I founded in the early 90s in response to indigenous people in the Amazon telling me that if we had gone down there to tell them that I wanted to help them save their rainforest, that I was committed to doing that. I sold my energy company. I'd taken these bribes. I had money. I wanted to help them. And they said, that's great, but understand that it's not we who are destroying these rainforests, we indigenous people. It's your big corporations. It's your oil companies. It's your lumber companies. It's your cattle companies. And so they said, stop them, and if you really want to stop them, you've got to realize that what's really destroying them is your dream, because you have this dream of huge skyscrapers and big factories and lots of cars and heavy industry, and you're now beginning to realize that as that dream has materialized, that in fact this is a very destructive dream. They were very sophisticated. So they said if you really want to change the world and save rainforests, and in fact save the human species, you've got to change the dream. So Dream Change is about changing the dream, and we have a wonderful program called Waking Our World, WOW, that will send teachers into communities and spend a weekend with local people, giving a workshop about this that they can then involve their own community and get people to really look at what we need to do to create a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world for ourselves and our children and grandchildren, and realize that in order to do that, we must take the whole world into account.
I agree with that.
So, and people can go to dreamchange.org and find out a lot more about that, Ron. So all that information is there, and if they want to invite our teachers into their community, then the information for how to do that is on that website.
Great. I will be looking into that because I'm very interested in that. I have a question for you. George Bush Sr., H.W. Bush was the ambassador to China. Was his job to go in there and soften them up to accept American corporations on their soil? Is that what he did? Was he kind of an economic hitman, or is that a bad description?
You know, once again, I hate to speculate on things where I wasn't personally involved, and I was never involved with him or China, in fact, at that time. But that typically was the job of U.S. ambassadors in many of these countries, was to open the door, to lay the path for American corporations. And certainly we've seen that happening big time. So that was done during that time. And, of course, Nixon went, you know, his historical trips to China in the early 70s that really opened that place up. And so when the ambassador like George Bush went in, that, you know, it certainly would have been part of his job. And again, I wasn't there, so I can't talk to specifics, but certainly that is the role of U.S. embassies all over the world. That's another thing. Most people think U.S. embassies are there and our foreign aid is there to help those countries. It isn't. For the most part, our embassies and our foreign aid is there to help our corporations, sadly. I'm very sad to say that it shouldn't be that way,
right.
but it has been increasingly during the last decade.
Well, I haven't given out the call numbers, but would you be interested in fielding a few phone calls if we can get a few?
I'd love to.
Well, we're going to head to a break. Welcome back to Facing Reality. There's that good music again. I hate to turn it down. Thank you for staying with us, everyone. Mr. Perkins, you still there?
Certainly am.
All right, we've got a couple of phone calls, but I want to run this out there real quick. The books that I have in front of me are called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and also The Secret History of the American Empire, Economic Hitmen, Jackals, and the Truth About Global Corruption. And the details are in there, and it details your life, basically the steps that you took and the actions you took that basically enslaved a lot of people. And I think that's why you have, you know, decided to come out and confess this stuff for several reasons, to clear your conscience and so you can try to make amends and help these people.
Well, you're right, and I feel, Ron, that we really can change all of this.
I do, too.
I'm very, very optimistic. I think the fact that this is all run by big corporations, basically, gives us that opportunity. We don't need to have a revolution like our forefathers did in the 1770s or other countries that had a bloody one. We need to have a consumer's revolution, basically. We need to understand that these corporations right now are driven by one primary goal, and that is windfall profits, to make a few rich people a lot richer. We need to change that and get them instead to define their goal as being to create a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world. They'll need capital to do that, and capital should get a return on its investment, a fair return, like we used to with blue chip stocks, to say 4, 5, 6% above inflation, maybe more if it's really high-risk projects, but not the 20 to 70% that venture capitalists are looking for today, and these outrageous salaries that CEOs are paying themselves, 400 times more than their average employee. We need to change that. And why I'm optimistic is because we've had tremendous success at changing corporations in the past for specific issues. Got them to clean up terribly polluted rivers in this country. Got them to get rid of aerosol cans that were destroying the ozone layer. Got them to open their doors wider to women and other minorities around the country, blacks. And we've got them to get rid of trans fats very recently in food, Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's. We just recently, Tyson's, the chicken people, announced they were no longer going to put antibiotics in their chickens because we, the consumer, had demanded it.
Had enough of it, hadn't we?
Yeah. And we've been very, very successful, Ron, at changing these corporations. Now we need to ratchet that up a notch and say, we're not just going to go after these specific issues. We're going to go after the big issue, which is, what is the reason for a corporation to exist? It should exist to be a good citizen, to be a good community, to serve the people who work there as well as the general public, and to create a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world.
I agree with you 100%, sir. Hey, we need to let Bill make an announcement on the Law of the Sea Treaty real quick. Bill?
The Law of the Sea Treaty is something that our listeners need to look into. This treaty is due to be voted on within the next 2-3 weeks by the Senate, for the Senate to ratify the treaty that President Reagan failed to ratify. Matter of fact, he helped kill it back when he was in office. But the Bush administration right now is pushing for the ratification of the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty. And people say, well, what is that? Well, what it does is it turns over by treaty 7/10 of the Earth's area, in other words, the oceans, to control of the UN.
Ownership.
Ownership, exactly. And you say, well, you know, what is that? Well, it would be the largest act of territorial conquest in the history of the world, and we would be circumventing our Constitution by turning over control of the sea. We're talking about the surface, the air above it, and the minerals and such below it.
That's right.
And I know the question that you're asking right now is, why is it necessary to sign a UN treaty in order for us to enjoy economic and resource benefits from ocean territory that we already own?
It's not. That's a racket. But what we're going to do next week, we're gonna hammer away on this thing right there, because it's something that needs to be talked about. But the corporatocracy. This is the government, the banks, and the corporations united together, and this is who you describe as the emperor of the empire. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, you know, in this time in history, what we've got is a group of people that basically play the role of emperor, and they really do pull all the strings of our government and every other major government in the world. I mean, it's very disappointing that we've allowed that to happen. When you come right down to it, our president and our Congress are beholden to these people and basically go along with what they want. That's what the war in Iraq is all about.
Well, that's something else. I tell you, you know, and it just goes so deep in like you described, the interchange of the people from the government to the corporation to the government back to the corporation, and as you describe here, when you owned your power business there, you described that a lot of the companies that were in a similar situation you were in, they failed, but due to you getting favors and you know, certain things like that, your company thrived.
Yes, you know, I did call in a lot of favors. I got some huge tax advantages that were actually read in the congressional record for my company, because people owed me favors, or they appreciated the fact that I hadn't spilled the beans about Economic Hitman at that point in time.
Uh-huh. How about that? You mentioned here on one of these sheets that that some of the work that you had done, let's see here, whenever these countries defaulted on these loans, then you guys would go in there and try to basically rob their resources and use the resources to bolster the profits of the corporation?
Yeah, in fact, you know, we set it up in such a way that they would have to default on the loans. That we realized that we were giving them way too big loans. And incidentally, that's not illegal. It should be. If Ron, I were your banker and I were to entice you into accepting a loan I knew you couldn't repay because I'd want a favor from you later on, that's illegal. But if I do that in the international realm with countries, it isn't illegal. It should be. But so we set it up that they would have to default on their loans, and at that point we go back and say, since you can't pay your loans, give us a favor, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or do something else that we want done on the political or economic level.
Yep, and what's important to note is this, that it is still going on today, but not by you, but there are more and more men doing this, men and women.
There certainly are, and, you know, back in my day, which was essentially the 70s, this was a generic type of thing. So I went out and made these things happen, you know, and arranged for some U.S. corporations to get big jobs. And usually I didn't really care whether the job went to Halliburton or Stone & Webster or Brown & Root or Bechtel or who it went to, as long as it was a U.S. company, and then my company would get involved too. That would happen. But today, in addition to people doing that, we still have that going on, but we also, every major international company, the Nikes and the Monsantos and the Exxons and all these big international corporations have their own version of Economic Hitman. And they're going out there doing something very similar, but with a specific goal of getting that company big favors in these countries, getting that company to make huge profits in these countries. So we've got these two different types of Economic Hitman kind of all working out there simultaneously.
But Mr. Perkins, I sure appreciate you joining us today, and I'm sorry that the phones, I couldn't get them to work here. I don't know, I probably did something wrong. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with the system here. It's probably me, but I apologize about that. But I do thank you for joining us, and maybe in the future we can get you back on.
I'd love to do that, Ron, and you're welcome. And I want to thank you because it's programs like this one that really are what is keeping democracy strong in this country. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, sir. You have a good evening, and again, congratulations on that grandbaby.
Thanks so much.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
Bye.
All right, people, I hope you enjoyed that one. That was Mr. John Perkins. Again, the website is johnperkins.org. You can get a hold of his material and read for yourself and get educated on this so we can spread the word. We need to make a difference, and I'm telling you, there is no option. We have to change things, or we're going to leave it in bad shape for our kids. Good night.
Spoken like a true American.